A young widow, living out of her car after losing everything, inherited a derelict dairy barn for the price of $4 in back taxes. But what she discovered hidden in the loft wouldn't just make her rich. It would give her a reason to live again. If you've ever felt like you've hit rock bottom, or if you've ever been handed a second chance that looked more like a burden, I hope you'll stick around for this one. And if my story resonates, maybe hit that subscribe button, because we're building a community here for people who know what it means to fight your way back. The air in the car was colder than the air outside. That's the thing about sleeping in a 2004 sedan in late October in the Pacific Northwest. The metal and glass don't hold warmth. They just seem to manufacture their own special kind of damp, penetrating chill. I was 18 for exactly 4 hours. No cake, no candles, just the quiet hum of a dying battery and the fogged-up windows that turned the streetlights into blurry, indifferent stars. My husband, Liam, had been gone for 6 months. The word widow felt wrong on me, like a formal dress that was 2 sizes too big, stiff and unfamiliar. At 18, you're supposed to be a girlfriend, a student, a daughter, not a widow, not a resident of a dusty Toyota with 180,000 miles on it and a driver's side door that only opened from the outside. The glove compartment was my pantry, holding a half-eaten bag of pretzels and 3 packets of gas station mustard. The trunk was my closet. The back seat was my bed, a lumpy landscape of blankets and one sad, flat pillow. I had aged out of the foster system the day I married Liam. He was my ticket out, my one great hope. He was 20, worked construction, and had a smile that could have convinced a glacier to melt. We had a tiny apartment, a stack of bills, and a plan. Then, a patch of black ice, a swerving truck, and our plan dissolved into a police report and a funeral I couldn't afford. The insurance paid for the hospital bill, and nothing else. The landlord was sympathetic for exactly 1 month. Then I was here, parked in this quiet suburban cul-de-sac, pretending to be waiting for someone if a cop knocked on my window. I was waiting, I guess, for something. I just didn't know what. That morning, my 18th birthday, I drove to the one place I still had a key to, a P.O. box I'd opened with the last $20 of wedding money. It was mostly a formality, a place to send job applications that never got a response. But today, there was something inside, a thick, cream-colored envelope. It felt heavy, important. It had a lawyer's return address embossed in the corner. My heart did a slow, painful lurch. Lawyers meant trouble. They meant bills I couldn't pay or questions I couldn't answer. I sat there in the driver's seat, the engine off to save gas, and held the envelope in my hands. The paper was cold, stiff. It felt like a final notice. For a long time, I just looked at it. It was a tangible object from a world I no longer belonged to, a world of offices and official documents and people who had addresses that weren't on wheels. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass, I tore it open. The letter inside was written on the same heavy paper. The words were formal, precise. It was from a man named Arthur Abernathy, an attorney at law in a town I'd never heard of, Oakhaven. He was the executor of an estate, my grandfather's estate. I had to read that part twice. My grandfather, Daniel Anderson, had passed away 3 months prior. I had met him only once, a brief, awkward visit when I was 6. He was a silhouette in my memory, a tall, quiet man who smelled of sawdust and soil. My mother, his daughter, had cut ties with him long before she died, for reasons she never explained. She just said he was a hard man who lived in a hard place. The letter went on. It said that my grandfather's will had been, in his words, unconventional. He had left his entire estate, what little there was, to his only living descendant, me, Ilara Vance, my married name. He'd known about Liam. That thought was a strange, sharp pang in my chest. The estate consisted of a single asset, a property. My breath hitched. A property? A house? A piece of land? A place to park my car where I wouldn't get ticketed? The lawyer's words brought me back to reality. The property in question, he wrote, is a disused dairy barn and the half-acre of land upon which it sits. It is, I must inform you, in a state of considerable disrepair. A barn. I let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. Of course, not a house, a barn. The letter continued. My grandfather had arranged his affairs so that all his debts were settled, but it had left the property itself with a lien against it for unpaid property taxes. The amount was negligible, but legally required settlement by the inheritor. The total amount due to take legal ownership of the property was $4.17. I read the number again. $4. I had that. I had $6.50 in crumpled bills tucked into my sun visor. The letter concluded with instructions. If I wished to claim my inheritance, I was to travel to Oakhaven, present myself at his office with the required funds and a valid ID, and sign the deed transfer. He included a crisp, new $20 bill in the envelope, clipped to the letter. For your gas, a handwritten note at the bottom read. Your grandfather would have wanted you to at least have the choice. A choice. For the first time in 6 months, I had a choice that wasn't about which gas station had the cleanest bathroom, or which parking lot was safest to sleep in. It was a terrible choice, a broken-down barn in the middle of nowhere. It was an absurd choice, but it was mine. I looked out the fogged windshield at the neat, tidy houses of the cul-de-sac, their windows glowing with warm, yellow light. They were like fish bowls, full of lives I couldn't imagine. Lives that didn't involve rationing pretzels or using public library bathrooms. My life was here, in this cold car. Or it was a $4 barn. I folded the letter, tucked the 20 into my visor, and started the car. The engine coughed to life, a rattling, wheezing sound that was, for the first time in a long time, the sound of moving forward. I didn't know what I was driving toward. Maybe just a bigger, colder box to live in. But it was a box that belonged to me. And for $4, it was the only home I could afford. The drive to Oakhaven was a journey through a landscape that seemed to be shedding its skin. The city's concrete arteries gave way to sprawling suburbs, which then frayed into strip malls and gas stations, and finally dissolved into 2-lane country roads flanked by dying fields. The sky was a vast, indifferent sheet of gray, spitting a cold, persistent drizzle that the wipers smeared across the windshield in hypnotic arcs. Every few miles, I'd pass a sign for a town that was little more than a post office and a boarded-up general store. The names were simple, worn down by time. Pine Creek, Cedar Ridge, Flat Rock. It felt like I was driving backward in time, leaving the polished, anonymous present for a past that was rougher, more elemental. My car, which had always felt like a fragile shell in the city, seemed more at home out here, its rattles and groans a fitting soundtrack to the decaying farmhouses and rusting tractors that dotted the countryside. My mind was a loop of questions. Who was this grandfather who kept track of me from a distance, but never reached out? Who leaves his granddaughter a dilapidated barn? Was it a joke? A final, cruel twist of a hard life. Or was it something else? My mother's words echoed in my head. A hard man in a hard place. Maybe this was just what he had to give. A hard inheritance. I thought of Liam. He would have loved this. He would have seen the adventure in it, the potential. He would have been drumming his fingers on the dashboard, pointing out interesting cloud formations and talking about how we could fix up a barn. "Anything can be a home, Ilara," he used to say. "You just have to be willing to do the work." The thought of him brought a familiar ache, a hollow space in my passenger seat that felt colder than the rest of the car. He was gone. The work was all mine now. The $20 bill Mr. Abernathy had sent was just enough. I filled the tank at a greasy station where the pump clicked off at $19.87. I spent my last few coins on a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, but it was hot, and I held it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into my numb fingers. Oakhaven appeared without much warning. The trees just thinned a little, and suddenly there was a main street with a single blinking traffic light. The buildings were old, mostly brick, with faded paint and proud, tired facades. A diner, a hardware store, a church, and a small building with a wooden sign that read, "Abernathy and Sons, Attorneys at Law." The "and Sons" was painted over, a slightly darker shade of green. I parked across the street, my car looking conspicuously shabby next to the clean pickup trucks that lined the curb. For a full 10 minutes, I just sat there, my courage failing me. This was the moment it became real. Up until now, it was just a letter, an idea. But walking into that office meant stepping into a life I didn't know, a story I was a part of but had never read. Finally, I took a deep breath, grabbed the envelope, and got out of the car. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. It was a clean, sharp smell, so different from the city's exhaust and garbage. The bell over the lawyer's door chimed softly. The office was small and tidy, filled with the scent of old paper and lemon polish. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick, leather-bound volumes. A woman with a kind, wrinkled face looked up from a typewriter. "Can I help you, dear?" I cleared my throat. My voice came out as a whisper. "I'm here to see Mr. Abernathy. My name is Ilara Vance." Her expression softened. "Ah, yes, he's expecting you. Right this way." Arthur Abernathy was an older man, probably in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that were the same color as the overcast sky. He stood up from behind a large oak desk as I entered, and his handshake was firm and dry. He wasn't what I expected. There was a gentleness in his demeanor that the formal letter hadn't conveyed. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." I sat in the worn leather chair opposite his desk. It sighed under my weight. I felt small and out of place, my worn jeans and faded hoodie a stark contrast to his pressed shirt and tie. He didn't seem to notice. He just looked at me with a patient, appraising gaze. "I was sorry to hear of your husband's passing," he said quietly. "And I was sorry to hear about your grandfather. Daniel was a client of mine for 40 years. He was a complicated man, but a good one." I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "He spoke of you, you know," Mr. Abernathy continued, leaning forward slightly. "Not often, but he kept track. He knew about your mother's passing. He knew when you went into the system. He knew when you got married." This was too much. A lifetime of silence, and he was watching from the wings the whole time. A hot surge of anger mixed with a confusing wave of grief rose in my throat. Why? I managed to ask. If he knew, why didn't he do anything? Mr. Abernathy leaned back, his fingers steepled. That's a question I think he wanted to answer himself. Which brings us to this. He slid a thick folder across the desk. The deed to the Anderson property. As the letter stated, it is legally yours upon payment of the outstanding taxes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills I had left. I smoothed them out on his desk. A $5 bill and a 1. He took a 5, opened a drawer, and produced 3 crisp $1 bills and a handful of coins. He carefully counted out $1.83 and pushed it back toward me. $4.17, he said, as if it were a million. He stamped a document with a heavy, satisfying thud. There, it's done. The property is yours, free and clear. He slid a rusty, old-fashioned iron key across the desk. It was heavy in my palm. Now, Elara, I feel I must be frank with you. The barn is in very poor shape. The roof leaks. Some of the foundation is questionable. To be blunt, it's not habitable. I have a car, I said, the words tasting like ash. It's better than a car. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Perhaps. There's also another matter. A development firm, Northwood Properties, has been buying up land in the valley. They made your grandfather an offer before he passed. He refused it. They've since sent a letter to the estate renewing their offer. They're offering $10,000 for the half-acre, as is. $10,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering. $10,000 could buy a reliable used car. It could pay for a security deposit on an apartment, first and last month's rent. It could buy food, clothes, a new start. It could buy a life. My mind raced. Sell it. Take the money and run. Start over somewhere new, somewhere warm. Forget this hard place and this hard man and his broken-down inheritance. They'll likely contact you directly, now that the deed is in your name, Mr. Abernathy said, pulling me from my thoughts. He handed me a business card. This is my number. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. He walked me to the door. As I stepped out into the damp air, he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Your grandfather was a man who believed things had a value beyond what was written on a price tag, he said softly. Give the place a look before you decide. I drove the 2 miles out of town, following his hand-drawn map. The road turned to gravel, then to a muddy, rutted track, and then I saw it. The barn stood on a slight rise, silhouetted against the gray sky. It was huge, far bigger than I had imagined, a great, sagging beast of a building. Its red paint was almost entirely peeled away, leaving the weathered gray wood exposed like bone. The roof on one side was bowed deeply, looking like it might collapse under the weight of the next heavy rain. It was, by any objective measure, a ruin. But as I killed the engine and stared at it through the rain-streaked windshield, I felt a strange, illogical pull. It was ugly, it was broken, it was probably worthless. But it was mine. Getting out of the car, the wet grass squelched under my boots. The key Mr. Abernathy had given me was for a massive padlock on the main sliding doors. It was rusted solid. I had to put my whole body into it, grunting with effort, until it finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. I slid one of the heavy doors open just enough to slip through. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the smell of old hay, dust, and decay. It was a cathedral of shadows. Light filtered in through cracks in the walls and holes in the roof, creating shifting columns of dusty light that illuminated dancing motes of dust. The scale of the place was overwhelming. The central aisle was wide enough to drive a truck through. On either side were rows of milking stalls, their metal stanchions coated in a fine layer of rust. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, draped over everything. A few swallows darted through the high rafters, their chirps echoing in the immense quiet. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my footsteps loud in the silence. My hand trailed along a wooden partition, the wood smooth and worn from decades of use. I could almost hear the ghosts of the place, the lowing of cows, the clatter of milk pails, the murmur of voices. This place had been full of life once. Now it was just a tomb. I saw what Mr. Abernathy meant. This wasn't a home. It was a project for a team of builders with $100,000 budget, not a broke teenager with $6 to her name. The developer's offer echoed in my mind. $10,000. I could be on a bus heading south by nightfall. No more cold nights in the car. No more pretending to be waiting for someone. I walked the perimeter of the ground floor. In a small, sectioned-off room, I found what must have been the milk house. A huge stainless steel tank lay on its side, and old glass bottles sat in dusty wooden crates. In another corner, a tack room held brittle leather harnesses and rusted tools I couldn't name. Everything was covered in the same thick blanket of dust and neglect. It was hopeless. The feeling settled in my stomach like a cold stone. This wasn't a second chance. It was a dead end. Another one. I was about to turn and leave, to slide the door shut and drive back to Mr. Abernathy's office and tell him to call the developers. But then I saw it. Tucked away in the darkest corner of the barn, almost hidden behind a stack of rotting feed sacks, was a ladder. It was bolted to the wall, leading straight up into the darkness of the second story. The loft. My grandfather's letter hadn't mentioned a loft. Mr. Abernathy hadn't mentioned a loft. It was just there, a place unseen. My curiosity, a feeling I thought had died with Liam, flickered to life. It was a faint, weak little flame, but it was there. A hard man in a hard place. What would a man like that keep in a place like this? I pulled at the ladder. It was solid. Taking a breath that tasted of dust and mildew, I began to climb, pulling myself up into the shadows, not knowing that I was climbing toward the answer to every question I'd ever had. The air grew warmer and drier as I climbed. The loft was a different world from the damp, cavernous space below. While the ground floor was a place of work, of animals and mud, the loft was for storage. It smelled differently, too, not of decay, but of dry, ancient wood and sun-baked hay. It was a scent that felt preserved, like opening a book that hadn't been touched in a century. I pulled myself over the top edge and onto the floorboards. They were wide, thick planks, covered in a soft, ankle-deep layer of dust and straw. The space was enormous, running the entire length of the barn. Light streamed in from a large circular window at the far gable end, its glass miraculously intact. The light illuminated a vast, empty space, a wooden desert under a canopy of massive arching beams that held up the sagging roof. It was quieter up here, too. The sound of the rain was a gentle patter on the roof, a soft drumbeat that made the silence feel even deeper. I stood for a moment, just breathing it in. There was a sense of peace here that was absent downstairs. It felt forgotten, but not abandoned. It felt like it was waiting. My eyes adjusted to the dim light. Most of the loft was empty, but against the far wall, partially hidden by shadows, was a collection of objects draped in dusty canvas tarps. They were lumpy, indistinct shapes, like sleeping giants. I walked toward them, my boots making soft puffing sounds in the dust. I reached the first tarp and pulled it back. A cloud of dust billowed up, making me cough. Underneath was a stack of old furniture. A beautiful hand-carved wooden bed frame, a rocking chair, a small writing desk with intricate legs. They were covered in dust, but otherwise seemed to be in perfect condition. It was a bedroom suite, stored away as if waiting for a house to be built around it. I pulled back another tarp. More furniture, a dining table and 6 chairs, their surfaces dull with grime, but the wood solid and unblemished. It was like someone had packed up their entire home and moved it into this loft. My home. The thought was absurd. A home without walls, without plumbing, without heat. It was a ghost of a home. I moved along the wall, my heart starting to beat a little faster. This wasn't just junk. This was deliberate. Tucked behind the tall bed frame, I saw it. A large, sea-worn wooden chest. It was bound with black iron straps and had a heavy, ornate lock on the front. It didn't look like a farm chest for tools or supplies. It looked like a treasure chest from a storybook. My breath caught in my throat. I knelt in the dust in front of it. The lock was old but formidable. I tugged on it, but it was solid. I looked around the loft, my eyes scanning for a crowbar, a hammer, anything. My gaze fell on a long, rusted piece of rebar lying near the edge of the loft opening. It was heavy, but I managed to drag it over to the chest. I wedged the end of the rebar into the hasp of the lock. I put all my weight on it, grunting, my muscles screaming in protest. The metal groaned. I pushed harder, sweat beading on my forehead, mixing with the dust on my skin. With a loud crack, the old wood of the hasp splintered and broke. The lock fell to the floor with a heavy thud. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, my heart pounding. My hands were shaking. I was afraid. Afraid of what I would find, and more afraid of what I wouldn't. Slowly, I reached out and lifted the heavy lid. It creaked open like a coffin. The inside of the chest smelled of cedar and thyme, and it was full, not of gold or jewels, but of paper. Neatly stacked bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, old photographs with curled edges, legal-looking documents brittle with age, and on the very top a single thick envelope with my name on it. Ilara. Just my name, written in a strong, slightly slanted hand. My hand trembled as I picked it up. This was it. This was the voice from the silence. I sat down on the dusty floorboards, my back against the chest, and carefully opened the envelope. The letter inside was several pages long, the ink slightly faded. My dearest Ilara, it began. If you are reading this, then it means I am gone and you have come home. I know it doesn't look like much of a home right now. It is, as my lawyer Arthur no doubt told you, in a state of considerable disrepair. But this barn, this land, is more than just wood and dirt. It is a story. It is our story. I had to stop and take a breath. The words felt impossibly close, as if he were whispering them in my ear. I could almost feel his presence in the quiet loft. I continued reading. He wrote about my grandmother, a woman I'd never known, who loved this land and the Jersey cows they raised here. He wrote about the life they built, the sweat and struggle and the simple joy of it. He wrote about my mother, his daughter, and the fire in her spirit. He described her as a girl who wanted to see the world beyond the valley, who felt constrained by the quiet life he loved. He didn't write about their falling out with anger, but with a deep, aching sadness. I was a proud man, he wrote, too proud. She wanted to leave, and I saw it as a rejection of everything I was. I said things I could never take back. She left, and my pride wouldn't let me call her back. It is the single greatest regret of my life. I let my stubbornness steal my daughter from me, and it stole me from you. Tears started to well in my eyes, hot and sudden. They dripped onto the dusty floor, making small, dark circles. This wasn't a hard man. This was a broken-hearted one. I learned of your mother's death from a newspaper clipping a friend sent me, the letter went on. And I learned you had been placed in the foster system. I wanted to come for you. God, how I wanted to drive down there and bring you home. But my pride had built a wall I didn't know how to tear down, and I was ashamed. What right did I have to be your grandfather after I had failed so miserably at being a father? So I did the only thing a coward could do. I watched from a distance. I had Arthur keep tabs. I saw you grow up in photographs. I saw the strong, resilient young woman you were becoming, and I was so proud and so deeply ashamed. I had to put the letter down. My whole body was shaking. The narrative of my life, the one I had told myself for years, that I was abandoned, forgotten, alone, was crumbling. I wasn't forgotten. I was watched over. By a man who was too ashamed to say hello. The grief was immense, for the years we'd lost. For the grandfather I never knew. For the mother I barely remembered. I cried. I sat in that dusty loft and sobbed, great heaving gasps that tore through my chest. I cried for the little girl who waited for a family that never came. I cried for the teenager who married too young just to have someone. I cried for the widow sleeping in her car. I cried for all the versions of me that had felt so utterly, completely alone. After a long time, the tears subsided, leaving me hollowed out and strangely calm. The rain had stopped. A sliver of late-afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending a brilliant shaft of light through the circular window. It fell directly on the chest, illuminating the dust motes like a shower of gold. I picked up the letter again. There was more. I am leaving you this place not as a burden, but as a choice, he wrote. I know its monetary value is little. In fact, a development company has been hounding me to sell. They see this land as a blank space for their cheap, soulless houses. They offered me what sounds like a lot of money to a man like me, and probably a fortune to a young woman in your position. The offer is likely still on the table. You could take it. You could sell this pile of rotting wood, take the money, and start a new life. There would be no shame in that. It would be a practical, sensible decision. And I would understand. I thought of the $10,000, the bus ticket south, the clean apartment. It was the easy way out, the sensible path. But I hope you won't, the letter continued, and the words on the page seemed to sharpen. I hope you will see what I see, not a ruin, but a foundation, not an ending, but a beginning. This place has roots, Elara, your roots. There is more to this inheritance than a plot of land. There is a truth hidden here, a truth I was too old and too tired to fight for. But maybe you're not. What did that mean? A truth hidden here. I looked around the loft, at the furniture, the chest, the letters. It felt like a puzzle, and I had just found the first piece. I finished the letter. The last lines were a plea. "Stay," he wrote, "just for a little while. Explore. Understand. The answers are here. And whatever you choose, please know this. I loved you. I was just too much of a fool to ever tell you." I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. The sun was setting, and the light in the loft was fading to a deep, bruised purple. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. My head ached. My stomach growled. The sensible thing to do was to climb back down, drive into town, and find a motel for the night. Use the last of my money for a warm bed. But I couldn't leave. Not now. I walked over to the rocking chair, wiped the thickest layer of dust off with my sleeve, and sat down. It rocked gently on the uneven floorboards, a quiet, rhythmic creak in the silence. This was my grandfather's chair. I was sitting where he sat. I looked out the round window at the valley spread out below, the trees dark against the fading light. A single light blinked on in a distant farmhouse. For the first time, looking out at the world, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt connected to this barn, to this land, to the ghost of the man who had left it for me. It was then that I noticed it. Tacked to the outside of the main barn door, almost invisible in the twilight, was a piece of paper protected by a plastic sleeve. I hadn't seen it when I came in. I climbed back down the ladder, my legs stiff, and slid the big door open. It was a formal notice from Northwood Properties. It was addressed to the estate of Daniel Anderson. It detailed their final offer, $15,000. They had raised it. "This offer is valid for 30 days, it read in bold type, "after which we will proceed with an application to the county to have the structure condemned as a public nuisance. $15,000. Or condemnation." They were boxing me in. They thought they were dealing with an estate, a legal fiction. They didn't know they were dealing with me. A cold fury, clean and sharp, cut through my exhaustion. This wasn't just a business offer. It was a threat. They wanted to bulldoze my grandfather's life. They wanted to bulldoze my story before I even had a chance to read it. I ripped the notice from the door, the plastic sleeve tearing. I crumpled it into a ball in my fist. I slept in my car that night, parked beside the barn. But it was different. I wasn't hiding. I was guarding. I leaned the seat back and stared up at the massive, dark silhouette of the barn against the starry sky. The clouds had cleared, and the night was brilliant and cold. The $15,000 was a siren song. It was safety. It was food. It was a roof that didn't leak. It was the logical choice. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to take the money, to escape. But my grandfather's words echoed in my mind. A foundation, roots, a hidden truth. What was I more afraid of? Spending another winter in my car, or walking away from the only piece of my history I had ever been given? Liam's voice came to me then, so clearly it was as if he were sitting in the passenger seat. "What's the adventure, Alara?" he would have asked, a grin in his voice. "The easy road, or the one with the treasure map?" I thought about the foster homes, the constant moving, the feeling of being a temporary guest in someone else's life. I had never had a place that was truly mine. I had never had roots. Maybe they were here, buried under the dust and decay of this old barn. Maybe home wasn't something you find. Maybe it was something you build, or in this case, rebuild. A decision settled over me, quiet and solid. It wasn't a choice made out of logic or practicality. It was a choice made from a deeper place, a place that had been dormant for a long, long time. I was going to stay. I was going to fight. I didn't know how. I had no money, no resources, no plan. All I had was a rusty car, a broken-down barn, and a chest full of lead. Stick with me. The story is far from over. Now, let's get back to the loft. I spent the morning with the letters. I sat on the floor, the sun warming the wood around me, and I read. I sorted them by date, creating a timeline of a life I had only glimpsed. There were letters from my grandmother, written before I was born, full of farm news and local gossip. There were receipts for cattle feed and veterinary bills. There were old, sepia-toned photographs of the barn being built, of my grandfather as a young man, tall and strong, his face full of hope. I pieced together the story of their life here, the good years and the lean years, the birth of my mother, the slow, painful process of the small family dairy farm becoming obsolete in a world of corporate agriculture. And then the letters stopped. There was a gap of almost 20 years, the silence that followed my mother's departure. The next dated items were from after her death, clippings about my life, school photos, report cards, a record. My grandfather, in his neat, slanted hand, had been investigating them for years. The ledger was filled with dates, names, and figures. He had documented every farm in the valley that Northwood had bought. He noted the purchase price, which was always well below market value. And next to many of the entries, he had made notes. Miller, foreclosure after well contamination. Clark, sudden crop failure, loan called in. Rossi, barn fire, low insurance payout. It was a pattern of misfortune followed by a lowball offer from Northwood. It was too consistent to be a coincidence. This wasn't just development, it was predation. He was building a case. I sat back, the ledger heavy in my lap. This was the inheritance. Not the barn, not the land. This ledger. This was the truth he wanted me to find. He wasn't just leaving me a home. He was leaving me a mission. But what was I supposed to do with it? Take it to the police? A book of handwritten notes against a wealthy development company. They'd laugh me out of the station. I needed more. I needed proof. His letter had said the answers were here. Not just in the chest. Here, in the barn. I stood up and looked around the loft again. This time, I wasn't just looking. I was searching. I started with the furniture, tapping on the back panels, checking for false bottoms in the drawers of the desk. Nothing. I ran my hands along the walls, the rough-hewn beams. Nothing. I was getting frustrated, my hope starting to curdle into despair. Maybe this was it. Maybe a book of suspicions was all he had. I went back to his first letter, the one addressed to me, and read it again, more slowly this time. I was looking for a hint, a code, anything. And then I saw it. A single sentence I had skimmed over before. My father built this barn to last 100 years. He used to say the strongest foundations are the ones no one can see. The floor. He was talking about the floor. I got down on my hands and knees and began to crawl across the loft, running my hands over the wide, dusty planks. They were all solid, nailed down tight. I worked my way from one end to the other, my knees aching, my hands filthy. Nothing. I was about to give up when my hand brushed against something under the writing desk, which I had pushed aside earlier. A single knot in one of the floorboards. It looked like any other knot, but as my fingers traced its edge, I felt it move. It wasn't a knot. It was a plug of wood, expertly carved to look like one. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dug my fingernails into the tiny gap around it and pulled. It came loose, revealing a small, finger-sized hole. I peered inside. Darkness. It was a handle. I hooked my finger into the hole and pulled up. A section of the floorboard, about 3 feet long, lifted up with a soft groan. It wasn't a loose board. It was a hidden door. Beneath it was a cavity, a dark space between the floorboards and the ceiling of the ground floor. And nestled inside that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, was a long, flat metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammunition can, painted black. It was heavy. I lifted it out and set it on the floor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latches. I finally got them open and lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was money. Stacks of it. Old, soft bills, bundled with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. It wasn't millions, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I counted one bundle, $5,000. There were 10 bundles, $50,000. I sat there stunned, just staring at it. $50,000. It was enough to change everything. It was a new life, handed to me in a metal box. My grandfather could have used this money. He could have fixed his roof. He could have lived his last years in comfort. But he saved it. For me. Beneath the money, there was something else. A thick manila envelope. I opened it. Inside were documents. Not my grandfather's notes, but official papers. Copies of geological surveys, water sample test results from a private lab, an affidavit from a former Northwood employee. It was all there, the proof. Northwood Properties had identified a valuable mineral deposit that ran through the valley. To get to it, they needed to acquire all the land, but cheaply. So they created their own misfortunes. The well contamination on the Miller farm? The lab results showed trace amounts of a chemical agent that killed crops and was difficult to detect. The Rossi's barn fire? The affidavit from the ex-employee described how he was paid to cause an electrical short. It was a cold, calculated, criminal conspiracy. They weren't just buying farms, they were stealing them. They were destroying people's lives for profit. And my grandfather had figured it out. He had spent his last years and his life's savings gathering the evidence to prove it. The $50,000 wasn't just an inheritance, it was a war chest. It was the funding for the fight he couldn't finish. And there was one last thing in the box, another letter, his final one. Elara, it began. If you found this, then you are smarter and more stubborn than I even hoped. And you now hold a very dangerous truth. This money is your choice. It is your escape hatch. You can take it, and this box of evidence, and disappear. Go to California, go to Florida. Buy a little house, be safe, be happy. No one would blame you. I wouldn't blame you. But if you choose to stay, this money is your weapon. It can hire lawyers. It can file lawsuits. It can give the people of this valley a voice. It can bring Northwood to justice. I know it is a heavy burden to place on you. It is the burden I could not carry to the finish line. But I did not raise a daughter who ran from a fight. And looking at your pictures, reading the reports about your life, I don't think she raised one either. The choice is yours. The safe life or the right one. Whatever you do, I am proud of you. Your loving grandfather, Daniel. I put the letter down, the paper trembling in my hand. The weight of his words, of his trust, settled on me. He hadn't just left me a barn. He had left me his legacy. He had left me his faith. The sun was high in the sky now, streaming through the window, and for the first time, the loft felt warm. I looked at the money. I looked at the evidence. The safe life, or the right one. For someone who had spent her entire life just trying to be safe, it should have been a harder choice. But it wasn't. There was no choice at all. My grandfather had spent his life protecting this place for me. Now, it was my turn to protect it for him. And for the Millers, and the Clarks, and the Rossis. I wasn't just fighting for a barn anymore. I was fighting for a valley. The first call I made was to Arthur Abernathy. I used the payphone at the gas station in town, the receiver cold against my ear. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "It's Ilara Vance. I've made a decision about the Northwood offer. I'm rejecting it, and I'd like to hire you. I think I have a case against them." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Ilara," he said finally, his voice cautious. "A case like that, it would require significant resources. Northwood has a team of lawyers in the city." "I have resources," I said, thinking of the black metal box. "And I have evidence." I met him at his office an hour later. I didn't bring the money, but I brought the ledger and the manila envelope. We sat at his big oak desk, and I laid it all out. I watched his face as he read. His calm, professional demeanor slowly melted away, replaced by a look of grim understanding, and then a quiet, simmering anger. He read the ex-employee's affidavit twice. He held the lab reports up to the light. When he finally looked up at me, his sky-blue eyes were hard as ice. "Daniel," he whispered, "you magnificent, stubborn old fool." He looked at me. "Their offer wasn't a kindness, Ilara. It was a threat. They wanted to bury this. If you'd sold, you would have signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of the sale. They would have bulldozed the barn, and this evidence would have been buried forever." "He knew," I said. "He counted on me to find it." Mr. Abernathy nodded slowly. "This changes everything. This isn't just a civil case anymore. This is criminal. Racketeering. Fraud. Arson." He leaned back in his chair, a new energy in his old frame. "I'm not the right lawyer for this, Ilara. This needs a bigger firm. A shark. But I know who to call. And with this evidence, they'll take the case. They'll take it on contingency." "I can pay," I said. "I want to pay." He gave me a long, thoughtful look. "All right," he said. "Let's make some phone calls." The next few weeks were a blur. Mr. Abernathy connected me with a powerhouse environmental law firm from Seattle. I met with a woman named Jessica Thorne, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who listened to my story and reviewed the evidence with an unnerving focus. She took the case. The $50,000 went into a trust account, a retainer for the fight to come. I didn't stay in my car. I used a small portion of the money to rent a room from a woman in town, the one with the kind face from Mr. Abernathy's office. Her name was Mary. She didn't ask too many questions. She just made me tea and left a hot water bottle on my bed at night. It was the first time I had slept in a real bed since Liam died. I didn't sleep well. I was too wired, too full of a nervous, righteous energy. Most days I was at the barn. I started by just cleaning. I bought overalls, thick gloves, and a dust mask at the hardware store. I shoveled out decades of caked-on dirt and manure from the ground floor. I swept the cobwebs from the rafters. It was back-breaking, filthy work, but it felt good. It felt like I was reclaiming something, like I was scrubbing away the neglect, my own and my grandfather's. I discovered the barn's secrets, a well-preserved workshop behind the tack room, with my grandfather's tools still hanging neatly on the wall. A small hand-dug root cellar under a trap-door in the milk house, cool and smelling of earth. Every day, the barn felt less like a ruin and more like a home. The lawsuit moved faster than I expected. Armed with my grandfather's evidence, Jessica Thorne filed a motion for an injunction to halt all of Northwood's activities in the valley. She also contacted the other families, the ones from the ledger. Some were hesitant, afraid, but others, when they heard Daniel Anderson's granddaughter was leading the charge, found their courage. A class-action lawsuit began to form. Northwood Properties fought back, of course. They sent their lawyers. They filed motions to dismiss. They sent a private investigator to dig up dirt on me. They found what little there was to find: a grieving, penniless widow who had been living in her car. They tried to paint me as an unstable, opportunistic grifter. But they couldn't explain the evidence. They couldn't explain the lab reports. They couldn't explain the sworn affidavit. Their case began to crumble. One day I was up in the loft, cleaning the furniture my grandfather had stored. I was polishing the writing desk, the wood grain emerging from under the grime, when I saw a car coming up the track. A sleek black sedan. It was so out of place it looked like a spaceship. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was a vice president from Northwood. He didn't offer to shake my hand. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth and cold, "we can make all of this go away. We're prepared to offer you a settlement, a significant one. $250,000, tax-free." The number just hung there. $250,000. Enough to go anywhere, do anything, to be anyone. A year ago, I would have wept with gratitude, but I just looked at him. I thought of my grandfather's letter, the safe life or the right one. "And the other families?" I asked. "What do they get?" He shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "That's a separate matter." "No," I said. My voice didn't shake. "It's not." I turned my back on him and went back to polishing the desk. He stood there for a few moments, and then I heard his car door slam and the sound of his engine fading down the track. I had won. I knew it in that moment. They were scared. The case settled out of court a month later. It was a massive settlement. Northwood admitted no wrongdoing, but they paid. They paid the families they had cheated, giving them back far more than their land was worth. They paid for the environmental cleanup. They abandoned all their claims in the valley. And they paid me. After the legal fees, my share was enough that I would never have to worry about money again. I wasn't just solvent, I was rich. But sitting in Mr. Abernathy's office, looking at the check, I didn't feel the elation I expected. I just felt a quiet sense of peace. The money was never the point. It was just a tool. The real inheritance was the barn. I moved my grandfather's furniture down from the loft. I set up the bed frame in the old milk house, which I had cleaned and sealed. I put his rocking chair by the big sliding door where it caught the morning sun. I used the money to hire a local crew to fix the roof. I learned how to mix cement and help them shore up the foundation. I learned the names of the locals at the hardware store. They started calling me Daniel's girl. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was part of the valley. One evening, as the sun was setting, I was sitting in my grandfather's rocking chair, looking out at the land. The barn was still a work in progress, but it was alive again. The swallows still darted in the rafters, but now they were my companions. The barn wasn't just a structure of wood and nails. It was a testament to a stubborn old man's love. It was a monument to second chances. The richness he had left me wasn't in the metal box. The money was just the means. The real wealth was the purpose, the fight, the connection, the feeling of belonging to a place and a story that was bigger than myself. He had given me back my own history. He had given me a home. Not just a roof over my head, but a place my soul could rest. I had arrived here a ghost, a widow in a beat-up car. But in the dusty loft of a $4 barn, I had found myself. My story had a difficult beginning, and for a long time I thought it had a tragic ending. But I learned that the end of one chapter is just an opportunity to write a new one. Life can knock you down so hard you forget what it feels like to stand. But sometimes, in the most unexpected places, from the most unexpected people, you get a hand up. My grandfather's inheritance looked like a pile of junk, but it was the greatest gift I have ever received. It taught me that home isn't a place you find, it's a place you build. It taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about the stories we choose to carry and the battles we choose to fight. And it taught me that true wealth has nothing to do with the number in your bank account. It's about having a place to stand and a reason to stand there. If you've listened to all of this, thank you. It means a lot to share it. We all have stories of loss and resilience, of finding light in the darkest of places. This channel is for those stories. If you feel a connection to that, I hope you'll subscribe and become part of our community. And please, in the comments below, tell me what home means to you. I'll be reading every single one, because every story deserves to be heard.